how the asylum seekers and refugees on Manus Island settle on the island and shores of Manus. Well, for this segment today, the students taking PNG Studies and International Relations, Year 3, will be discussing in a panel discussion. Questions will be asked by students from different universities in Papua New Guinea. The students will discuss and explain to the audience and viewers about how the asylum seekers ended up on the shores of Manus Island using the convention, the 1951 convention, and protocol relating to the status of refugees. So if you're interested in any of this on the topic of asylum seekers and refugees, this is the right video for you.
Hello, my name is Joshua Kaina. I am a third-year nursing student here at Pacific Adventist University. Okay, my question is, how did the asylum seekers and refugees end up on the shores of Manus Island?
A refugee, according to the convention, is someone who is unable or unwilling to return to their country of origin, owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion. There are two types of refugees that fled their countries. The first type of refugees are the refugees who have the visas, passports, and proper documents to enter our country. And the other type of refugees are the refugees who do not have those proper documents to enter our country. In this case study, we'll only be talking about the refugees that are fleeing by boat, because those that are arriving by plane aren't detained. Plus, they can immediately apply for a protection visa and are typically given a bridging visa while their application is processed. Both people, on the other hand, are immediately moved to a detention center and they can't immediately apply for a protection visa. Instead, they are screened into a refugee status determination process to determine whether they'll be allowed to apply. The term boat people originally referred to the thousands of Vietnamese who fled their country by sea following the collapse of the South Vietnam government in 1975. Crowded into small vessels, they were prey to pirates, and many suffered dehydration, starvation, and death by drowning. The term was later applied to the waves of refugees who attempted to reach the United Nations by boat from Cuba, Afghan, and other refugees seek asylum in Australia. And this is how the term boat people entered the Australian vernacular in the 1970s with the arrival of the first wave of boat people carrying people seeking asylum from the aftermath of the Vietnam War. The boat people came by boat because they don't have an Australian visa and therefore aren't allowed to fly into any Australian airport. The application process and requirements for an Australian visa are quite difficult and time-consuming. And if you're fleeing for your life, you don't usually have the time to complete the application, have your documents certified, and wait around for the visa to be approved. The first wave of refugees starts from April 1976 and ended in August 1981. The second wave began from November 1989. In 1999, a third wave of asylum seekers began, and the boat that changed it all was the Tampa affair in August 29, 2001. Therefore, an asylum seeker is an individual who is seeking international protection, while a refugee is a person who has fled their country of origin.
My name is Kimberly Lamos. I'm a third-year nursing student here at Pacific Adventist University. My question is there any law or convention that is recognized by the international community that protects the rights of the asylum seekers and refugees?
The 1951 Refugee Convention and its 1967 Protocol is commonly referred to as the 1951 Refugee Convention and Protocol relating to the status of refugees. Now, this convention protects the rights of refugees. Throughout the 20th century, the international community steadily assembled a set of guidelines, laws, and conventions to ensure the adequate treatment of refugees and protect their human rights. The process began under the League of Nations in 1921. In July 1951, a diplomatic conference in Geneva adopted the Convention relating to the status of refugees, now known as the 1951 Convention, which was later amended by the 1967 Protocol. This document clearly spells out who is a refugee and the kind of legal protection, other assistance and social rights a refugee is entitled to receive. It also defines a refugee's obligation to host countries and specifies certain categories of people, such as war criminals who do not qualify for refugee status. So initially, the 1951 Convention was more or less limited to protecting European refugees in the aftermath of the World War II, but the 1967 Protocol expanded its scope as the problem of displacement spread across the world. Now, the 1951 Convention contains a number of rights and also highlights the obligations of refugees towards their host country, as mentioned above. Now, the cornerstone of the 1951 Convention is the principle of non-refoulement, now contained in Article 33 of the Convention itself. According to this principle, a refugee should not be returned to a country where he or she faces serious threats to his or her freedom. Now, this protection may not be claimed by refugees who are reasonably regarded as a danger to the security of the country, now, or having been convicted of a particular serious crime, or is connected or considered to the community, a danger to the community. Now, other rights contained in the 1951 Convention includes the right not to be expelled, except under certain strictly defined conditions, the right not to be punished for illegal entry into the territory of a contracting state, and the right to work and other laws as well. So the convention itself was ratified by 148 state parties, or known as member states, and Australia is one of them. So the agency that is responsible for the refugees is the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, and it assists states to protect refugees.
My name is Jawan Takunai, a third-year Communication for Development Studies student at the Papua New Guinea University of Technology. In the wake of the asylum seekers and refugees on Manus Island, how and why did they settle there in Manus?
After the waves of boat people arriving in Australia, the Australian government came up with policies and agreements on how to solve the massive amount of refugees on the territorial waters. John Howard, at that time, was the Prime Minister of Australia and implemented the Pacific Solution policy to seek assistance from the neighboring Pacific Island countries, Papua New Guinea and Nauru. Honorable John Howard said in a media press that they decide for who will enter their country and under what circumstances. There are two sides on how Australians responded to the asylum seekers, the negative and positive responses, and I will outline the impacts of both. He intensified that the asylum seekers are illegal immigrants and queue jumpers and do not deserve to be rewarded with preferential treatment ahead of those applying through the correct channel. Australians see the asylum seekers as queue jumpers and that they are not genuine refugees but economic migrants, which means that they came to Australia to consume resources and services that should be rightly reserved for Australians. Many of Australia's citizens responded negatively by giving out reasons why asylum seekers should not be settled on Australia. Firstly, asylum seekers should be sent back to their place of origin, and second of all, they believe that the asylum seekers are connected or associated with terrorism and is a threat to the democratic regime. Results from a survey revealed how Australians feel about refugees being settled in Australia. Almost half, 48% of the 1,200 Australians surveyed believe that refugees currently residing in Nauru and Manus Island detention centers should never be settled in Australia, versus 45% who agree they should be settled in Australia. Moreover, almost 40% see asylum seekers coming to Australia by boat as a critical threat to Australia's interests. On the contrary, on behalf of Australian Immigration Department, the UN Refugee Agency decides who should be resettled in Australia. There are 7 categories in which the UN Refugee Agency used to select eligible refugees for resettlement program. And these are legal or physical protection needs, survivors of torture and or violence, medical needs, women and girls at risk, family reunification, children and adolescents at risk, lack of possible alternative durable solutions. Now, Australia has 4 offshore refugee category visas. Refugee visa subclass 200, in-class country special humanitarian visa subclass 201, emergency rescue visa subclass 203, and women at risk visa subclass 204. Now, these 4 visas are used by the UN Refugee Agency to resettle asylum seekers on the 2 offshore processing centers of Manus Island and Nauru. However, due to the fact that Australia was one of the first signatory states of the Refugee Convention, the Prime Minister John Howard came up with the initiative of Pacific Solution.
I am Simon Pune, a third-year mathematics and computer science student enrolled at the Papua New Guinea University of Technology. Is the Manus Detention Center establishment legal? How was it funded and by who?
The Pacific Solution for asylum seekers arriving in Australia's waters by boat was to be seen in the context of broader changes in Australian foreign policy. The policy was halted because of the incoming Kevin Rudd Labour government, which assumed office in December 2007. At that time, Rudd's new Minister for Immigration, Mr. Evans, described it as a cynical, costly and ultimately unsuccessful exercise. But since there was a large amount of refugees, Australia, PNG and Nauru struck a deal under which the latter 2 would take in refugees from the intercepted boats in exchange for money. For the Manus Island camp, the plan was to subsequently house the refugees in PNG if their asylum claim was proven valid. If not, then the refugees would be either sent back to their country of origin or to be sent into a different country altogether or to remain in the detention center indefinitely. But in Nauru's case, where the population constraints are severe, Australians took their initiative of sorting out new ideas for regional settlements for their case. Prior to the recommencing of both offshore camps, the transportation of refugees resumed in 2012 under the Julia Gillard's government. In 2013, in Gillard's success as Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd was restored as the Minister of Immigration, and he signed a regional resettlement arrangement with Papua New Guinea, agreeing to the objective of ensuring that any unauthorized maritime vessel arrival in Australian waters will be liable for transfer to Papua New Guinea in first instance for processing and resettlement. The Manus camp has been widely criticized since its 2012 reopening, just like Nauru. The United Nations and human rights groups have described conditions in the centers as horrid, saying that the refugees living there are subject to severe abuses and neglect. In 2016, the PNG court ruled that the detention on Manus Islands regarding the refugees were illegal and in breach of fundamental human rights. Therefore, the Australian and Papua New Guinea governments shall take all steps necessary to seize and prevent the continued unconstitutional and illegal detention of the asylum seekers or transferees at the relocation center on Manus Island.
Hello, my name is McLaren Aqua and I am a third year student of the University of Papua New Guinea taking political science. My question is, when the asylum seekers first arrived on the shores of Australia, why didn't Australia take them?
There are two reasons as to why Australia did not take in the refugees. The first is Australia's problem with the asylum seekers. Australia has always been viewed as the world's leader in resettling refugees since the World War I. Apart from this, Australia has also been classified as one of the world's lowliest countries in providing durable and reliable solutions to the people who arrive on their shores, especially to claim protection, which are the asylum seekers. The first wave of asylum seekers who arrived by boat on the shores of Australia was received by the Australian public with sympathy. Continuing arrivals quickly became a matter of increasing concerns. Public discussion soon focused on such issues as rising unemployment and the impact of people jumping the immigration line. The second reason is Australia's policy on asylum seekers and refugees. Australia has had a policy of mandatory immigration detention established since 1992. This policy was introduced by the Keating government. It was described as hardline policies, which specifically stated that any person, in reference to asylum seekers or refugees who comes into Australia without a valid visa, will be held in detention up till a visa or leave is granted for the person to remain or leave the country. The political and policy response to the boat arrivals has typically been twofold. The first one is emphasizing the importance of ensuring that those arriving unauthorized by boat meet the convention definition of a refugee and returning those who do not. And the second is attempting to stop further flows of people from reaching Australia in this way. In 1998, a report from the Human Rights and Equal Opportunity Commission on the policy of mandatory detention argued that the policy has breached the international human rights standards. This led to the creation of what the so-called Pacific Solution in 2001.
Hello, my name is Mary Teret Asiari, and I'm a Year 3 student studying English Communication at the University of Papua New Guinea. My question is, what are some of the disadvantages and advantages of PNG taking in refugees?
The resettlement of the refugees dates back to 2001 to 2007 and from 2012 to 2016. From 2001 to 2007, it was under the Pacific Solution, and from 2012-2016, it was under the Regional Resettlement Arrangement. The Manus Regional Processing Center has brought major infrastructural developments into the country, especially on the island where the processing center is located. The two governments, the Government of Australia and the Government of Papua New Guinea, agreed upon some major infrastructural projects. Some of the major infrastructure projects outlined in the agreements is fixing and upgrading of roads and highways, upgrading of the Momoti Domestic Airport, fixing the island's water supply, police housing, upgrading of the local hospital, building a technical high school, and a broadband network. Most of the work on these major infrastructure developments are funded under the Regional Resettlement Arrangement. Most of the companies working on this infrastructure development are Australian national companies. Locals are only subcontractors to these Australian national companies. Like any project, the Manus Regional Processing Center has advantages and disadvantages. So the advantages are observable, the disadvantages outline the advantages that are observable. Some of the advantages of the Manus Regional Processing Center are as follows. Major developments of road infrastructure, the Lorengau General Hospital upgrading. The road is especially the main highway from the airport to the town. the Momoti Airport upgrading, which is currently underway, and most cash flow within the province. Some of the disadvantages of the Manus Regional Processing Center are as follows. Large profit of the project goes back to the Australian government, since most of the companies operating on the center are Australian national companies. A rise in social issues, especially in the childhood pregnancy, marital problems, increase in the consumption of alcohol and drugs, and other social issues. Incomplete infrastructure, especially the Momoti Airport that was supposed to be completed under the project, it is still incomplete. The Manus Inland Highway, the island water supply, and the building of the technical high school in the province.
Hello, my name is Stephanie Kim Mete, and I am a student of Aji University here in South Korea, majoring in software and computing engineering. The convention that your team has chosen, how is it in line with your case study according to the international law?
Okay, to answer the question, I'll relate the case study to the international law. Okay, firstly, international law consists of the rules and principles of general application dealing with the conduct of states and the international organization in the international relations with one another and with private individuals, minority groups, and transnational organizations. Okay, the law that gives effect to our case study is the customary international law. And the customary international law itself regulates the making of treaties and conventions, which is where the 1951 Convention and the 1967 Protocol comes under. Many countries have been taking in refugees over the centuries, and that practice has become a norm. During 1920, when the ICJ committee set to compile the international law, they took into practice the practice of non-refoulement. As mentioned in the beginning by the second member of the group, the process began under the League of Nations in 1921. In July 1951, the diplomatic conference in Geneva adopted the convention relating to the status of refugees, which is the 1951 convention. And the convention was more or less limited to protecting European refugees in the aftermath of World War II. The core principle is non-refoulement, which is the fundamental principle of customary international law, and it forbids a country receiving asylum seekers from returning them to a country in which their lives would be in danger, especially Article 33 of the Convention. The UNHCR serves as the guardian of the 1951 Convention and the 1967 Protocol. According to the legislation, states are expected to cooperate with the UNHCR in ensuring that the rights of refugees are respected and protected. These documents clearly spell out who is a refugee and the kind of legal protection, other assistance, and the social. The only two global legal instruments which explicitly cover the important and vital aspects of refugees and their lives are the 1951 Convention and the 1967 Protocol. According to their provisions, refugees deserve as a minimum the same standard of treatment enjoyed by other foreign nationals in a given country, and in many cases the same treatment as nationals. The 1951 Convention also recognizes the international scope of the refugee problem and the importance of international unity and cooperation in trying to resolve them. The 1951 Convention does not define how a state party are to determine whether an individual meets the definition of a refugee. Instead, the establishment of the asylum proceedings and refugee status determination are left to the state to develop. This has resulted in different states as governments craft asylum laws based on the different resources, national security concerns, and the histories in forced migration movements. States remain sovereign and they have the discretion to decide whom they are going to admit to the territorial boundaries. But they are under an obligation to place someone where their lives would not be in danger, like creating detention centers to process them. The asylum seekers does not have any right to claim asylum. Despite the differences at the national and regional levels, the overarching goal of the modern refugee regime is to provide protection to individuals forced to flee their homes because their countries are unwilling or unable to protect them. States have been granting protection to individuals and groups fleeing persecution for centuries. However, the modern refugee regime is largely the product of the second half of the 20th century. Like the international human rights, the modern refugee has its origin in the aftermath of World War II, as well as the refugee crisis of the interwar years that proceeded. The controlling international convention on refugee law is the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees. The 1951 Refugee Convention is the key legal document that forms the basis of the UNHCR work. Refugee and outlines the rights of the displaced as well as the legal obligation of state to protect them. Although the 1951 Convention definition remains the dominant definition, regional human rights treaties have since modified the definition of a refugee in response to displacement crisis not covered by the 1951 Convention. So the law that gives effect to our case study is the customary international law and other international law.
To end this discussion, the 1951 Convention and Protocol relating to the status of refugees protects the rights of refugees and spells out the kind of legal protection, other assistance, and social rights a refugee is entitled to receive. In the case of the asylum seekers on Manus Island, their existence is the result of the Tampa affair that happened on the 26th of August 2001. Because of the 1951 Convention and its 1967 Protocol that Australia is a signatory to, Australia could not send back the asylum seekers back to their places of origin. A solution was created, and that solution was the Pacific Solution. The Pacific Solution diverted asylum seekers to 3 countries in the Pacific: New Zealand, Nauru, and Papua New Guinea. Detention centers were established on these countries for offshore processing. However, due to debates on the legality of the detention center on Manus Island, the asylum seekers have now been moved to Bomana Detention Center in Port Moresby, Papua New Guinea. The significant article under the 1951 Convention and Protocol relating to the status of refugees is Article 33, titled Non-Refoulement. Its significance is due to the fact that it explains the reasons for Australia not sending back the asylum seekers when they first arrived on the shores of Australia. Australia's response was in adherence to international law. Breaking international laws would mean severe punishment, and that was something Australia did not want to. The Convention covers all forms of international law, from human rights to migration laws to the international refugee law.